The grand chandelier above the restaurant cast a fractured glow, its glittering shards of light scattered across the polished floors like the remnants of broken dreams. Beneath its cold elegance, laughter rang out, sharp, derisive, and cruel. It came from a man seated at the corner table, surrounded by a cloud of wealth and privilege. His suit, a custom weave of the finest silk, shimmered like his golden watch, but his smile carried the sting of mockery. "Play for us, won't you?" His voice was smooth, oily, laced with arrogance. His eyes, a piercing shade of disdain, were fixed on the waitress before him. She stood frozen, her hands clutching the tray of empty glasses like a shield against his words. Her uniform, though tidy, looked like a fragile barrier against the judgment pressing down on her. The man leaned back in his chair, surveying her with an exaggerated air of boredom. "You do know how to play, don't you? Or was that another lie?" She flinched, her breath catching in her throat. Around them, a murmur spread through the crowd. Waitstaff darted nervous glances her way, their unease palpable. But no one stepped forward. No one dared to challenge him. The piano stood to the side, its gleaming surface reflecting the light of the chandelier. It was a centerpiece of the room, usually reserved for hired performers. Tonight it had become the stage for a cruel game. "Go on," the man pressed, his tone deceptively light. "Entertain us." The waitress's knuckles whitened as her grip tightened on the tray. Her gaze flickered to the piano, then back to him. A faint tremor ran through her body, but she did not speak. Her silence seemed to amuse him further. "Cat got your tongue?" he sneered, his laughter joined by a few hesitant chuckles from his table companions. Finally, she set the tray down with deliberate care. Each motion was slow, measured, as though she were calculating her every move. The room seemed to hold its breath as she walked toward the piano, her shoes tapping softly against the marble floor. As she sat on the bench, the man's smirk widened, but she did not touch the keys immediately. Instead, she paused, her fingers hovering over them like a sculptor preparing to mold marble. For a fleeting moment, her eyes closed, and something flickered across her face. Defiance? Resolve? Then, with a single resonant chord, she began to play. The sound was haunting, filled with a raw, aching beauty that pierced through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the room. The man's laughter faltered, replaced by something else entirely. Her music told a story, one of pain, resilience, and secrets too deep for words. And as her melody unfolded, the man's smug facade began to crack. The room leaned in, spellbound, as the waitress transformed from a victim into a force of nature. Yet the question lingered: what would happen next? A look of shock crossed the man's face. Was it recognition, fear, or something far more dangerous? The opulence of the restaurant was a world unto itself, a sanctuary for the elite. Crystal chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and the soft hum of classical music created an ambience of effortless sophistication. For the man at the corner table, this setting was as natural as the air he breathed. He had been born into wealth, his every step cushioned by privilege. His life, however, was not without its challenges, though none of them bore the weight of survival. His struggles were the kind that money couldn't easily solve, the gnawing emptiness that came from always having more yet never feeling enough. He masked this hollowness with arrogance, his laughter a weapon to deflect introspection. The people around him were not companions but mirrors reflecting his curated superiority. Tonight, he sought amusement, and the waitress had become his target. She, on the other hand, lived a life worlds apart. The restaurant, with all its grandeur, was not her sanctuary but her battlefield. Each shift was a delicate dance between invisibility and servitude. She had learned to anticipate the whims of the wealthy, to smile through their dismissive gestures, and to disappear when her presence became inconvenient. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, she carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. Her childhood had been a symphony of hardship, marked by nights spent in cold rooms with a piano as her only solace. It was an old, battered instrument in her grandmother's living room, a relic of a life long gone. Her grandmother, with her wrinkled hands and soft, raspy voice, had been the first to teach her. Music, she'd said, was a language of the soul. The waitress had clung to those lessons like a lifeline, playing through hunger, loss, and despair. The piano became her refuge, a place where she could escape the relentless tide of life's difficulties. But life had been relentless nonetheless. Dreams of conservatories and concert halls had crumbled under the weight of financial reality. Now, her talent lived in the shadows, hidden behind the polished tray she carried from table to table to the outside world. The man seemed untouchable. His tailored suits and commanding presence gave him an aura of control. But inside, he was a cauldron of insecurities. His wealth, inherited rather than earned, had become a gilded cage. The constant pressure to maintain appearances, to uphold the family name, gnawed at his psyche. He hated the dependency that came with his fortune. Every deal, every handshake in his business ventures, carried an unspoken reminder that he was standing on the foundation built by someone else's labor. To mask this, he became a master of performance, always in control, always the center of attention. Tonight's dinner was supposed to be a routine indulgence, another evening of idle chatter and meaningless luxury. But when he overheard the waitress humming softly as she moved between tables, something inside him snapped. She was too composed, too calm for someone in her position. He wanted to see her crack, to remind her of her place. It wasn't cruelty, he told himself. It was just entertainment. Her days were a relentless cycle of exhaustion and worry. Between shifts at the restaurant, she took care of her younger brother, a quiet boy with a sharp mind and a fragile body. Medical bills had drained what little savings they'd had, and now every dollar she earned was a lifeline. She tried to keep her music alive, sneaking moments at the public piano in the park late at night. But the fire that once fueled her had dimmed. The world didn't reward talent born in poverty. She had learned. It demanded conformity, subservience, and silence. When the man at the corner table singled her out, she recognized his type immediately. He was one of the countless faces she served every day, entitled, dismissive, and certain of their own importance. But his challenge was different. He wasn't just demanding service. He was demanding her dignity. The piano, her sanctuary, had been dragged into his cruel game. She approached the piano. Memories of her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Play with your heart, not your hands. The heart never lies. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. No, this was anger, raw and unfiltered. She would play, but not for him, not for anyone in this room. For the man, the game was unfolding exactly as planned. He would expose her as a fraud, unravel her composure, and confirm his belief that people like her were all the same. Fragile, desperate, and easily broken. But there was something he didn't know. The waitress had not survived her life by being fragile. She had survived by being unbreakable. And tonight, in this gilded cage of his making, she would find her voice again. The room, sensing the stakes, grew silent. Waitstaff and patrons alike paused in their movements, their curiosity piqued. The man leaned back in his chair, his smirk firmly in place, but a flicker of unease passed through his eyes. The waitress's fingers hovered over the keys, her shoulders squared. Her gaze, steady and piercing, met his across the room. For the first time, the man felt a twinge of doubt. In the silence before the first note, an unspoken question hung in the air. Was this a harmless game, or had he awakened something far more powerful than he anticipated? The waitress's fingers hovered above the piano keys, their slight tremble hidden by the polished black lacquer. The room, so recently filled with the hum of idle chatter and clinking glasses, was now steeped in an almost unbearable silence. Every eye was on her, the weight of their judgment pressing against her like an invisible hand. The man at the corner table leaned forward, his smirk unwavering. He had expected hesitation, perhaps even a timid refusal, but instead, there was this quiet, unsettling resolve in her. It unnerved him in a way he couldn't articulate. And then she played. The first note hung in the air, resonant and haunting. It wasn't the cheerful, unassuming melody he had anticipated. Instead, it was a storm, brooding and full of unspoken emotion. The chords that followed were sharp, deliberate, each one peeling back a layer of the room's carefully curated elegance. Gasps rippled through the audience as the music transformed the air around them, heavy with something primal and raw. The man's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected this. The waitress's music wasn't just good. It was extraordinary. Every note she played seemed to tell a story, one that didn't just echo her struggles but laid them bare for all to see. The room was spellbound, the usual walls of wealth and status melting under the sheer power of her performance. For the waitress, this moment was no longer about him or his cruel game. This was about reclaiming the part of herself she had buried long ago. The piano keys seemed to burn under her touch, igniting something deep within her, a long-dormant fire that now roared to life. She played not just for herself but for the dreams she had abandoned, for her brother, for every humiliating moment she'd endured in silence. But as the melody reached a crescendo, something shifted. A figure emerged from the back of the room, an older man in a tailored suit with an air of authority. His presence sent ripples of unease through the staff, many of whom quickly diverted their gazes. The waitress's hands faltered for a fraction of a second as she caught sight of him. Her chest tightened. She knew who he was. The older man was not a regular patron, but his influence was well known. He was the owner of the restaurant and a ruthless businessman whose reputation for crushing those who crossed him was legendary. His sudden appearance now seemed anything but coincidental. "Interesting choice for entertainment," he remarked dryly, his voice cutting through the music. The waitress's heart pounded, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her music was her only armor now, and she refused to let it waver. Yet, the man's words seemed to carry an unspoken threat, and the room's atmosphere shifted from awe to apprehension. The man at the corner table straightened, his earlier smugness replaced by unease. He had intended to humiliate the waitress, not draw the attention of the restaurant's formidable owner. "Is this your doing?" the older man asked, his gaze piercing. The corner table man stammered. It was just a bit of fun." The older man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Then, with a dismissive wave of his hand, he signaled for the waitress to continue. She resumed, her fingers finding the keys with renewed determination. But her mind raced. Why was he here? What did he want? As the music flowed, snippets of conversation drifted through the room. Whispers of the waitress's past began to surface. A patron near the bar leaned toward his companion and murmured, "Did you know she used to perform? In competitions, I think. Heard she was a prodigy." "Then what's she doing here?" the companion replied, their voice tinged with disbelief. The question lingered, unanswered but heavy with implication. The man at the corner table overheard this exchange, and something inside him shifted. His earlier satisfaction at orchestrating her humiliation was now tinged with doubt, and an unwelcome pang of guilt. Meanwhile, the waitress's thoughts were a whirlwind. The older man's presence wasn't random, she realized. He had once been connected to her family in a way she wished to forget. Years ago, he had been instrumental in the downfall of her father's business, an act that had plunged her family into the poverty she now fought to escape. As the performance continued, the older man's expression hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He recognized her now. The music reached its final, triumphant note, and the room erupted into applause. But the waitress barely registered the sound. Her gaze locked with the older man's, her defiance flickering against the shadows of her fear. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I remember you." The corner table man, sensing a shift in power dynamics, interjected hastily. "I didn't know she could play like that. It was just a harmless joke." The older man cut him off with a glare. "Harmless? You call this harmless?" His voice rose, and for the first time, the corner table man looked truly uncomfortable. But before he could respond, another voice spoke up, a patron from the crowd. "She's brilliant. That wasn't just music. It was something else entirely." Several others murmured their agreement, and the tide began to turn. The waitress, who had felt so alone moments ago, now found herself buoyed by unexpected allies. The older man's eyes narrowed as he studied her. "You've made quite an impression tonight," he said, his tone unreadable. "But don't think for a second that changes anything." His words were a dagger, a reminder of the precarious balance she maintained in this gilded cage. Yet they also carried a hint of something else: respect? Recognition? As the crowd began to disperse, the corner table man lingered, his expression conflicted. He approached the waitress hesitantly, his earlier bravado gone. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to." He trailed off, his words faltering under her steady gaze. "You got what you wanted," she replied coldly. "But it didn't turn out the way you expected. Did it?" Before he could respond, the older man stepped forward again. "You're wasted here," he said, his voice brusque but not unkind. "Come by my office tomorrow. I may have a use for you." The waitress stared at him, unsure whether his words were a lifeline or another trap. Her fingers, still trembling from the intensity of her performance, curled into fists at her sides. As she turned to leave, the corner table man called after her. "Wait, please. I can help you." She paused, her back to him, before finally replying, "Help me? Or help yourself?" The room seemed to shiver with the weight of her words, and the unanswered questions hung in the air like ghosts. What did the older man truly want? Why had the corner table man's attitude shifted so drastically? And, most importantly, would the waitress take control of her destiny, or would she remain a pawn in their games? The waitress left the restaurant that night with the older man's words echoing in her mind. "Come by my office tomorrow. I may have a use for you." They sounded more like a command than an opportunity. As she walked home through the dimly lit streets, her thoughts churned. Could she trust him? Could she even afford not to? Her instincts screamed caution, but something else stirred beneath her apprehension. Something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was fragile, almost painful, but undeniable. If this was a way to escape her current life, to rebuild what had been shattered, she had to consider it. Yet, she couldn't shake the memory of how the older man had once destroyed her family's dreams. The next morning, she stood outside a towering office building, her heart pounding in her chest. She had dressed in her best, simple, clean, professional, though she couldn't hide the nervous tremor in her hands. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The older man's office was as intimidating as he was. Massive windows overlooked the city skyline, and the room was adorned with expensive artwork and furniture that oozed power. He sat behind an imposing desk, his expression unreadable. "You showed promise last night," he began without preamble. "But talent alone isn't enough. What do you want, really?" The waitress hesitated. She thought of her brother, their mounting bills, the relentless grind of survival. But she also thought of her music, her grandmother's lessons, her abandoned dreams. "To play," she said finally. "To live by my music, not by serving others." The older man studied her for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. "There's an opportunity," he said slowly. "A competition, prestigious, well-publicized, the kind that could change your life. But there's a catch." Of course, there was a catch. The older man reached into a drawer and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the desk. The waitress's breath caught as she recognized the face. It was the man from the corner table, his smirk preserved in glossy perfection. "He's sponsoring the competition," the older man said, his tone clipped. "And he's not happy about last night. If you compete, he'll do everything in his power to ensure you fail." Her pulse quickened. "Then why are you telling me this? Why offer me the chance?" A shadow crossed the older man's face. "Because I owe your family a debt," he admitted, his voice softer now. "Your father trusted me once, and I betrayed that trust. I've lived with that guilt for years. Helping you succeed won't erase what I did. But it's something." The waitress stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She wanted to lash out, to blame him for everything her family had suffered. But she also saw the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet torment of a man trying to atone for his sins. "Why would he care so much about sabotaging me?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with suspicion. The older man hesitated before answering. "Because you embarrassed him. Men like him don't forgive easily. And there's one more thing." He paused, the words heavy on his tongue. "He's my son." The room seemed to spin. The waitress gripped the arm of her chair, struggling to process the revelation. The man who had mocked her, humiliated her, and now sought to destroy her dreams. He was the son of the man offering her this chance. "How could you let him become like that?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger. "How could you stand by and let him hurt people?" The older man's jaw tightened. "I wasn't a good father," he admitted. "I gave him everything except the one thing he needed, discipline. I let my own guilt, my own failures, blind me to the man he was becoming. But I can't undo the past. All I can do is try to make things right now." The waitress stood, her anger fueling her resolve. "If I agree to this, it's not for you," she said. "It's for me, and for my family." The older man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then you have my support. But be prepared. He won't make this easy." Later that day, she found herself face to face with the man from the corner table. He had summoned her to a private meeting room under the guise of discussing the competition. But his true intentions were clear the moment he spoke. "Back again, are we?" he sneered. "You're ambitious, I'll give you that. But don't think for a second that you can win. Not against me." The waitress met his gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "This isn't about you," she said. "It's about me." Her calm infuriated him. "You humiliated me in front of everyone," he snapped. "And you think I'm just going to let you walk away from that?" "You humiliated yourself," she countered, her voice cold. "All I did was play." His face darkened, but before he could respond, she continued. "You can try to stop me, but it won't work. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of you. Or anyone like you." Her words struck a chord deeper than she expected. For a moment, he looked almost human, his facade cracking under the weight of her defiance. But he quickly masked it with a sneer. "We'll see," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Let's see how far your talent really gets you." As she left the room, she felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. The stakes had never been higher, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time, she felt truly alive, ready to face whatever came next. The competition day arrived with a weight of anticipation that seemed to permeate the air. The audience buzzed with excitement, the stakes higher than ever. Among them sat the older man, his expression stoic, and the corner table man, his gaze fixed on the stage with a simmering intensity. They hadn't spoken since their last confrontation, the tension between them an unspoken storm. The waitress stepped onto the stage, her nerves taut but her resolve unshaken. The grand piano stood waiting, its polished surface gleaming under the spotlight. She took a deep breath, sat down, and let her fingers find their place. As the first note rang out, the world around her seemed to fade. This was her moment, and she was ready to claim it. Her performance was transcendent. Each note told a story of struggle and triumph, pain and perseverance. It wasn't just music. It was a declaration of her journey, a testament to her resilience. The audience sat spellbound, their applause thunderous when the final note faded into silence as she left the stage. She met the eyes of the older man. There was no need for words. His slight nod conveyed everything. In that moment, he saw not just her talent but her strength, a quality that no amount of wealth or privilege could replicate. For him, it was a bittersweet redemption, a chance to make amends, however belatedly. The corner table man, however, couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. He had seen in her performance a reflection of his own shortcomings, his own emptiness. Her triumph wasn't just hers. It was an indictment of everything he had taken for granted. Later, as the waitress packed up to leave, he approached her. His arrogance was gone, replaced by an awkward humility. "You were incredible," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for everything." She studied him for a long moment before replying. "Apologies are easy. Change is harder. If you mean it, prove it." With that, she walked away, her head held high. She didn't need his validation. She didn't need anyone's. She had found her voice, and it was enough. The restaurant's glittering walls had been a cage for both the waitress and the man at the corner table, though in different ways. Her journey revealed a truth that resonated beyond their differences. True strength lies not in wealth or power, but in the courage to rise above adversity. For the audience, her performance was unforgettable, a reminder that talent and perseverance can break even the deepest cycles of oppression. And for the waitress, it was a new beginning, a world of open doors, no longer defined by servitude, but by the music that had always been her soul's voice.